Ranked 188 out of 188 on the United Nations Human Development Index, and with a total fertility rate of 7.6 births per woman, so that's an average, the West African nation of Niger is considered both the poorest nation in the world and also has the world's highest total fertility rate. So this confluence of extreme poverty and pronatalism situates it as the perfect site for questioning maternal morbidity, and in particular, a birthing injury called obstetric fistula. So, obstetric fistula is a birthing injury caused by prolonged obstructed labor in the absence of access to emergency obstetric care, particularly cesarean section. So, obstetric fistula is caused by prolonged pressure of the fetal head against the soft tissues of the pelvic wall, and as a result, there's a pressure necrosis, or a hole. And urine and feces can pass through the vagina, as a result, causing prolonged and unremitting incontinence that can only be redressed through surgery. So fistula has been nearly eradicated in the global north since the late 1800s, but still exists throughout the global south, particularly in Niger. So statistics on fistula are very spotty at best, largely because the women who are most vulnerable to fistula are in places that are hard to access and thus hard to count, rural areas. But it's estimated that Niger has one of the highest rates of fistula in the world. So I spent the last few years working in both rural and urban Niger in 4 fistula centers and following 100 women who struggle with the condition. So generally, my project works on kind of 3 main topics that we can break down. First is the humanitarian representation of women's bodies in the global south. Second is the clinical encounter between the biomedical establishment and the disempowered. And third is thinking about how flawed bodies are conceptualized, talked about, and treated in local communities, in clinics, and in Western rhetoric. So let's move back home for a minute. Recently, obstetric fistula has gotten a lot of media attention in the West. Fistula is portrayed as highly stigmatizing in humanitarian and media narratives. These narratives present women with fistula as, and I quote, lepers of the 21st century, according to New York Times columnist Nicholas Kristof, and women suffering from a fate worse than death, according to a recent CNN article. But my work really complicates these narratives. So I argue that the representations follow a formula that is emblematic of long-standing patterns of engagement of women's bodies in the global south, and particularly in Africa. My research both critiques the representations of gendered African bodies and also the humanitarian industry in general, examining both the consequences of these engagements within women's clinical encounters, but also within their social networks. Additionally, I investigate the ways in which biomedicine, but particularly surgery, is positioned as a silver bullet. I argue that surgery not only falls short of treatment objectives, so within the 100 women that I followed, only 36% of the women who underwent surgery attained continence, while 64% did not. Ironically, it is often the process of treatment seeking itself, and not the condition for which women were seeking treatment, or fistula, that is the result of increased social marginalization and social stigma. Balancing the hope for a cure with the risk of increased social harm, I examine how women strategically decide when and if to abandon and reinitiate the plans to pursue surgical solutions. Finally, I look at how flawed bodies are understood and cared for locally. I look specifically at the ways in which the sickness of urine, which is what fistula is known as locally, fits into notions of the body and local structures of caretaking in the time of illness. I critically engage in the ways in which local understandings of aberrant bodies, genitals, shame, pain, and the ways in which what it means to be a woman whose body is perceived as damaged and disabled negotiate reproductive constraints within pronatalist terrains. Thank you.